be aware, recently Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds released a new best of collection spanning their considerable 30-plus year history. And there's a special deluxe edition of the album that comes with a beautiful hardback book, which perhaps Lynn can lift up and be our Sale of the Century showgirl. So this book of essays, also called Lovely Creatures, as is the best of album, it's a very beautiful hardback book. It's a very special kind of really beautiful artefact. And it's full of essays about the band and about Nick Cave and their progression over the years, and a really interesting mix of academic writers, people who were there, you know, during the making of some of these incredible songs, and just fans and you know, writers who and cultural critics who were able to dig into the aspects of the band's history. And so we're going to talk quite a bit about this book tonight, because we're very lucky to be joined by all 5 of the Australian contributors to this book. And I'm just going to introduce them, and then we'll get straight into it. So immediately to my right is Bleddyn Butcher. Bleddyn was born in England and transported... Bleddyn was born in England and transported to Western Australia, where he was raised and scathed. He returned to the UK in 1980, where he worked for NME, photographing musicians and other entertaining personalities. His books include Save What You Can, The Day of the Triffids, a biography of David McComb, and A Little History, Nick Cave and Cohorts, 1981 to 2013. His photographs are included in the permanent collection of the National Portrait Gallery, and he lives in Sydney. Please join me in welcoming Bleddyn. To my second right is Lynn McCredden. Lynn teaches and researches in the School of Communication and Creative Arts at Deakin University, and she has an ongoing research interest in popular culture and its intersections with issues of sacredness, which I think you can probably guess where that's going in relation to Nick Cave, and we'll dig into those connections in a little bit. Please join me in welcoming Lynn. To my third right, I don't know if that's the technical term, but you know what I mean. To my third right, Mark Mordue. Mark is the editor of Neighbourhood, a new monthly inner-city newspaper for Sydney. His previously published work includes the travel memoir Daskar, Diary of a Head Trip, and the poetry chapbook Things That Year. Mark's essays, interviews and reviews have been published internationally, and he was the winner of the 2010 Pascal Prize for Australian Critic of the Year. He's currently at work on a long-awaited biography of Nick Cave, as well as a series of poetry books written on his iPhone using camera and notes applications. Please join me in welcoming Mark. Second from the end, Dr. Karen Welberry was born in London and grew up in Canberra. She studied literature, and in 2004 she gave a paper on Nick Cave to the annual Australian Literature Association conference, which eventually turned into a co-edited book with Tanyard LDL, Cultural Seeds, Essays on the Work of Nick Cave. Karen currently works as an English and literature teacher in secondary education, and please join me in welcoming Karen. And all the way down the end, Gerard Elson. Gerard's writing has appeared in Kill Your Darlings, Best Australian Essays and elsewhere. He's currently working on his first book, a biography of sorts, of the musician Roland S. Howard, and he lives in St Kilda. Please join me in welcoming Gerard. All right, well, there's so much to get to. So I'm going to start with Bleddyn, because your essay in the book, it's the first essay, and it takes us right back to London in 1983 and 1984, and to the recording of the first Bad Seeds album, From Her to Eternity. And you kind of dump us in there in the recording studios and give us this sense of the maelstrom, but also the really incredible coming together of artistic know-how that was happening at that time, and the convergence of talent and ideas that happened. And you had been photographing Nick before this with the birthday party, and you have continued to do so for many decades that followed. But I wonder if you can think back to that era around the very beginning of the Bad Seeds, and was there a feeling that something had changed significantly between the birthday party and the Bad Seeds, and that something was coalescing around this group of musicians, and that they would, one day we would be sitting in the art centre having this very refined conversation, or was it still kind of the chaos and debauchery of the birthday party lingering?
No, in short. When I talked to Nick before writing this essay, he spoke to me about how he fell into a great slough of despond at the end of the birthday party's last tour of Australia, and spent, I think he said, 3 or 4 weeks at his mum's place, which I think was in Elstonwick then, maybe not. Anyway, with no idea of what to do. I wasn't in Victoria, I was in London, and when he came back to London, he seemed to be a one-man hive of industry. I spent a lot of time with him in September 1983, and he was furiously writing. He suggested to me that we call it from doubt to certainty, and I didn't see
This is the book?
The essay.
The essay?
Yeah. I didn't see any doubt. I saw a great deal of determination, and I was shown the lyrics, and they, of From Her to Eternity. This is in 1983, and I think Wings Off Flies, and there didn't seem to be any. There seemed to be a continuity to me with Swamplands and many other things that I'm not going to go into a pointless list about. To me, he was always a writer, and which is what he clearly is now. So I didn't see. I see it as seamless. For me, it was seamless because I was taking pictures for Mutiny at the same time as he was in the studio doing the first 3 songs off From Her to Eternity. So that's an initial no. Secondly, the atmosphere in the studio, which I think is also a part of your question, was very experimental. I can remember Jim Fetus and him doing battle over the piano rhythm or over the rhythm on a piano to Wings Off Flies, and that was the last I saw of Jim. I think Nick, and Liddy was there, but at that time Nick was sort of feeling his oats. I think he realised that he had made an impact on a foreign country, not Australia, and that he had the clout to actually engage the interest of Mark Armand and these other people, and was exulting in it. He doesn't remember it that way, but that's what I saw.
Sometimes other people can be more perceptive than ourselves in a big moment like that, and with a lot of other things going on. Yeah. Sometimes an outsider's perspective, and particularly I think as a photographer, you're sitting outside of a moment as well as being inside.
I am an outsider. I'm not a musician, and so my job is observing, hopefully accurately.
That's really interesting. I'm going to go over to Karen if I can, and sort of I think we talked a bit about that Nick had found a modicum of appreciation internationally. So I'm going to ask about the Australianness of Nick. And in your essay, Karen, you write about the swaggering humour of Nick Cave's lyrics, which is something that he does so well, and kind of with this really disarming charm. The wit and the self-deprecation are perfectly content to point out how clever he's being as well, but never takes himself too seriously. And you talk about this humour and it being a particularly Australian brand of humour, and I wonder if you could give us a little snapshot of what your research on how you apply that to the Australianness of Nick Cave's lyrics.
Okay, is this working? What do I need to do? It is working. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I guess when I got interested in how funny Nick Cave was, this was in the context of everybody saying that he wasn't funny. And there was a prince of darkness and gloom and doom, and this kind of very dark image of Nick Cave seemed to be all you were hearing about in the media. And I suppose from my perspective, and I'm someone who's very interested in post-colonial kind of literature, I just was always smiling and laughing to myself at what he was doing by subverting a whole lot of sort of canonical texts and almost quoting or half quoting lyrics from, the romantic artists and other sources, and actually twisting and turning them. And I was very interested as well in the way that he'd rhyme things that shouldn't rhyme. And I've quoted some examples in my essay, but I think my favourite one is dirty dishes and vicious, and autumn and boredom, and things like this that are actually, they're playful and they're funny. And I suppose I saw connections between what he's doing in quite a lot of his lyrics and what a lot of post-colonial writers who were trying to subvert, I guess, the dominant centre of, what great literature is meant to be. And I saw that as playful and also very interesting. So while I'm saying it's Australian, I think what I mean is it's characteristic of a lot of writers who aren't, I guess, English, and who are taking the language that's been held up as the premium product and actually doing something that's a little bit wicked with it, just lyrically, but also, visually in a lot of the video clips to a lot of the songs. And we have little cartoon bunnies appearing on Breathless. We have a boat on the wing at sea, so a song that might seem very, very serious, when you actually get the visual element, it's undermined by that sense of humour.
Yeah, beautiful. Mark, I wanted to ask you next about your essay and the conditions under which it was produced. You've been writing about Nick for many years, and as I mentioned in your intro, you're working on a biography, so you've obviously got a rich vein of material on which to draw in order to contribute something to this collection. And your essay asks who wrote the Mercy Seat, one of the best known and probably, I'll say, best Bad Seed songs. And you kind of excavate the creative process under which the song was written and try to discern, who contributed what, and whether you can even say that one person did the lyrics and one person did the melody or what have you. But it's also an ode to the partnership between Nick Cave and Mick Harvey in the period during which that song was written. So I wanted to ask you what it was about the Mercy Seat that made you decide that this would be your contribution to a book, a retrospective book of the band's career, and what it was that made it perhaps a microcosm for exploring those really
to be honest, I want to write about From Her to Eternity.
I wanted to do the Mercy Seat.
But Nick said, no, Bleddyn's doing that. And I said, are you sure? I thought he wanted to do the Mercy Seat. He said, From Her to Eternity. And I kept saying, I want to write about From Her to Eternity. Bleddyn was fucking there when we did From Her. All right. So it was a little bit less grandly obsessed than that, but and so the conception of it really came, and I was a bit unsure about it, and actually kind of nervous about it as a project, because I didn't really know how I could hold it together. But I fairly quickly realised that really the nature of the song and the nature of what I was being asked to do indirectly was to explore the significance of the partnership between Nick and Mick Harvey, and to some extent, I guess if I'm being really honest, it's a kind of encoded love letter between them as an essay, because obviously their partnership has disintegrated and ended, and now Warren Ellis is Nick's main collaborator. And Mick Harvey was incredibly, from school days right through to the 21st century. So there's a massive body of magnificent work there. And I guess I felt in some respects Nick wanted me to write about that particular song in a way to say thank you to Mick Harvey. And that's how it seemed to me as I kind of developed writing and understood more and more about how they actually built the song. And it was kind of an education for me as well, because I'm not a musician. So when they start talking about A, B, C, D, and I'm just on piano on the phone to me, trying to sort of help me understand how My Way was constructed and how My Way was an indirect inspiration for the Mercy Seat. And I'm like, oh, really? And, yeah. So But obviously there's a lot there. I think the Mercy Seat really represents a particular style in Nick's lyrics, which is a very kind of high density form of storytelling. I mean, those kind of songs that Nick was doing, like the Mercy Seat, the Carney, Mutiny in Heaven. I made a joke about this in an article recently, but they're like Netflix series in one song. They're just humongous. I'm surprised actually that they don't turn them into HBO and Netflix series. Really, there's so much going on in them.
And they kind of have with Peaky Blinders.
Yeah, of course, exactly. So I don't know if I'm answering your question very well, but I guess Nick kind of pulled me into the song and writing about it, and then I just sort of felt the relationship between Nick and Mick and its importance, and it was a real kind of pleasure to talk to the both of them and get an education and the building of the song too, because that song's probably a little bit unusual in that it didn't come easily, and that a lot of it was built in the studio and torn apart and rebuilt, and it was sort of very much kind of constructed as much as it was written, and I think it was a struggle. And the struggle is manifest in the kind of fighting pulse in it, and that contributes, of course, to its meaning as well.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, I think you convey those different perspectives of two very talented and very creative men, but in such different ways. And when that comes together, you can get magic, or you can end up not wanting to work together anymore, I suppose. But there's a hilarious line where Mick talks about people asking him if he was the one who was doing all the work behind the songs because Nick was too, drugged up and he wasn't actually doing it, and for so long.
Exactly.
If it was all me, why wouldn't I just do it myself? And I think that's like, you need that magic,
Well, I mean, this is, I may as well discuss it since it's one of the sort of Melbourne vibes, the Nick versus Mick argument, the Nick versus Roland argument, and people seem to take sides like they're taking sides in a broken marriage. But the people who actually had those relationships and experienced it have a much more kind of complex and ongoing love between one another. And I don't know, it's kind of childish. It's like people think that they're backing football teams or something. But those people are very large, potent, creative entities, and I think they actually have a greater respect for each other than some of the people who claim to support them.
That's really interesting. Lynn, I'd like to talk to you next because your essay also talks about the Mercy Seat, but from a sort of more thematic perspective. And as I mentioned in your intro, you've done a lot of research into the intersections of popular culture and sacredness and the way that those two things intertwine. So your essay looks broadly at the sacred and the profane in Nick Cave's work through the Mercy Seat, but through a bunch of other songs, because of course that's something that comes up over and over again, and often really beautifully as well as in really dark ways. And you have a lovely line where you say his songs are bridges between earthly and sacred places. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about why this aspect, I mean, I know this is your research more broadly, but why you think this aspect is so affecting in Nick's music and in his songwriting, and how it affects you as a listener, but also listeners broadly.
Thanks very much, and good evening to everybody. I guess I came at the songs and the interest in the sacred. It just hit me in the face in song after song after song. Here was someone who had a deeply spiritual kind of side, if you like, an interest in the writings, not just of Jesus, but of a lot of different masters, and who actually studied and read them. And I'm sure most of you know that about his work. It hits you again and again, doesn't it? Sometimes it's to deny the power of that sacred and to say we're here in this earth and this profane place, and that's all we've got. So he's a journeyer, isn't he, through a lot of those issues. And but I thought this was my very own secret way of reading his work. Of course, it's not, because a lot of you would have seen this and appreciated this. But he doesn't just say there are two realms, does he? There's the earthly and the sacred. He actually is picking away and away and away at what the connection, if there is. What's the bridge? What's the connection? How are they enmeshed with each other? And that's a really big question. It's not just to say we're fleshy people, we're human beings, and we're sexual and we're corporeal, but what is the relationship of that to those other questions beyond the physical? So for me, it's an ongoing absolute fascination in his work, and I think it's an ongoing issue with him. But I don't know him personally, but I was asked to be part of this project, and thank you to Karen very much for initiating it all those years ago. But apparently Nick read the book of Karen's, and he read my essay, and his PR people rang me up and said, would you be willing to entertain a phone call from Nick Cave? And I said, what? Yes, I would. And so I was in a cafe in Lygon Street in Carlton, and the phone rang, and someone at the other end said, hi, this is Nick. I go, oh, hi. And so I had this wonderful conversation with a very down-to-earth man, a very ordinary sort of bloke, and he was great. He was terrific. I thought I could hear some real Aussie accent there after all these years. So I tend to think of him as an Aussie in all sorts of ways that connect with what Karen's talking about too, the post-colonial, the Australianness of what he does, even though he's an incredibly cosmopolitan man as well. But the earthy and the sacred is what I'm interested in, and sacred not just in a sort of a narrowly religious sense, but in where people come together and make foundational meaning. And he's interested in meaning. He's interested in how people come together musically in the studios. How do people make the meaning in those songs? It's a beautiful picture you get throughout this book of those different studio sessions right across different countries, and the way in which they came together as musicians, and he as the lyricist and others as the lyricists, and coming together and making meaning. It's a fabulous model. So thank you.
Absolutely, and that reminds me, one of the essays that I wanted to just mention at some point tonight is by Jane Forsyth and Ian Pollard, the directors of 20,000 Days on Earth, the first sort of film about Nick. And I think it's such an interesting essay because you've got two filmmakers writing about the process of music being made. And so it's these, in terms of the way you make meaning, it's all these different forms of art kind of coming together in one place, and it's one of the last essays, if not the last one, and it's a really beautiful one. Anyway, side note, but obviously you're all going to buy the book if you haven't already. So you have much to look forward to. Now, I'm sorry, Gerard, I've left you to last, but it'll be good. Not least. We're not going to say who the least is, but it's not you.
I hope it's not
that
me.
remains to be seen.
I'll be really angry.
It's me, everyone relax. Gerard, your essay in this new book is called Afraid of Things Staying the Same. And it's, I think, a very personal examination of the Bad Seeds' history of reinvention, of remaking their music, and of Nick remaking himself and his kind of image. And it's this quality of reinvention that has perhaps, arguably, allowed the band to have such longevity, because it's been, as we say, 30 plus years. The fans that were fans in the 80s are no longer the same people they were then, and yet people have this long-lasting love affair with the band. And their output has never really become complacent or repetitive. You can point to periods, and you do, where they, very distinct shifts over time. So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about the way that the Bad Seeds songs have accompanied moments in your life, because you do that really beautifully in the essay. But also what you see the key to this reinvention as being.
Yeah, I think I really like something which Lynn said earlier, which is the idea of Nick as a lyricist of being this kind of traveller, like a voyager or a flaneur of some sort, and that's something I've always really responded to from a very early age, listening to his lyrics as this little human figure moving through these just scenes of dense chaos and insanity. But what I think should be really highlighted at this point about that too is that the Bad Seeds themselves, of course, are this incredible, like almost caravan who come with him on every journey and are completely sympathetic and empathetic to everything he's doing as a lyricist and as a narrator of these songs. But so my brief for this was, I kind of came on, I think, pretty much at the 11th hour, really, and sort of got invited to climb over the back fence and have a look at the Bad Seeds' career in that sort of sense. And
He underselling himself, Bleddyn.
well, as it's, I came on, as a listener, I came on board around the time of the Boatman's Call. So I was born in 1984. And my essay starts with me sort of saying I was in the womb when this album came out. You know, I wasn't going to be born for a few months later.
Freaking us
And
out.
feels like a fair while ago now to me too. But the first time I started listening to them was sort of in the summer that I was going from primary into high school. And at that time, the singles from the Boatman's Call were being played on pretty high rotation on Triple J. So that was me kind of being inducted into the kind of dangerous realm of rock and roll. I grew up in a small town in coastal New South Wales and had a Catholic education, so it was, there was a lot that I guess I responded to in those songs. First album I got was No More Shall We Part, and I sort of thought, okay, I know what this band is doing, and I love them. I'll start going back and getting the earlier stuff, so I thought I'll do it chronologically. And of course, what's the first song? The immediate album, prior to the Boatman's Call, which is Murder Ballads, and of course that just kind of blew my head off. And so I guess I kind of take that as a microcosm of looking at the idea of reinvention in the Bad Seeds' career, because that really is probably the most dramatic schism aesthetically which they ever made, I think. And of course they'd been flirting with ballads and things like that for some time by then, the Ship Song, etc. But it was a much better brief than I think Nick realised when he asked me to do that, because as I say, I came on board right at this most dramatic point of reinvention. And but I just think it comes down to, just as you sort of said, it's a refusal to become complacent. It's a kind of very fertile, fruitful sense of restlessness, perhaps insecurity in some sense too, I think, which can also be a very powerful engine of creativity. All these things, but I think really it's just a refusal to stagnate. And I really think that if it weren't for the fact that the band has always worn suits, that people would talk about that a hell of a lot more than really seems to be, the common discourse around the band is that, oh yeah, they're all pretty dour bastards, aren't they? And it's like, well, how closely have you listened?
Yeah, that makes me think of Bowie, if you had this really particular visual iconography to go with each phase, it's very easy to go, oh yeah, Thin White Duke.
Chameleon,
oh, yeah. And but as you say, the black suits, which is so iconic. But visually, if you're looking at pictures from different studio recordings from throughout their careers, they might look a bit older, or there might be a few new faces, but it looks the same, but it doesn't sound the same.
That's right.
Yeah. Speaking of change and transition, Bleddyn, you've taken all these hundreds of amazing photographs of Nick and of the various Bad Seeds, and I would commend your incredible book of photographs, A Little History, to the audience as well. It's a really fabulous snapshot over the years. Can you talk a little bit about how Nick responds to being photographed and how his awareness of his photographic image and of himself as a photographed person has changed over time?
Yeah, I can, I guess. He's not very good at candid photography. He likes to control his expression, which for a photographer is really frustrating. Because that's a one photo session, and you absolutely know what he wants, and mostly he wants to look pretty tough, and that's easy to do, but not to parade myself as someone who's infinitely competent. At the beginning, I was not able to push him around properly. And in the early 80s, probably up to about 84, his main goal was to avoid the camera's eye, which meant that I was supposed to approach him like he was an actor. And yet, as he quite candidly admits, he's a pretty shit actor. So what he was projecting was obvious, and I would obviously want to, not obviously, but I'm telling you, I would want to undermine that, and I would want to get something more candid. I think I was able to do the tough photos okay, but the first thing that really felt sweet to me was the first time I went to Berlin and hung around with him, for days on end, and took this picture that was a really candid picture, which is also of him smiling at me, which doesn't really fit with the image, but I was so proud of it, and it's like a millisecond. In actual fact, it's 125th of a second, but it didn't. He was just doing his hair in Elizabeth, his girlfriend at the time's mirror, and going through the pre-photo session ritual of making himself up, and presumably I said something that was mildly amusing. And he turned to me and laughed, and I had the camera up. It was in focus, correctly exposed, and that was the first photo. Not so much the one of him and Roland, but that was the first photo that I was really proud of. So actually, I think you need to ask me another question to sort of spur.
What's that?
Well, or repeat what you said.
How has that changed? Or has it changed? Is he still
Well, how did it
resistant,
change?
or has he
Because
become a bit looser?
He's become much looser. He doesn't actually have a selfie face yet, but
A duck face?
He's quite happy. He's quite happy to pose for those photos, and it's now possible to sort of talk to him and take pictures at the same time and get the reactions without them being censored. I don't know. He's very self-conscious. He's about the most self-conscious person I've ever met, and the most camera-conscious person. So we all are. I think everybody knows when they're had their photo taken, but he's aware that it's historic, potentially.
Yeah, that's quite weighty. Maybe I'd be a bit alarmed too if you're like, oh, this is going in a book in 20 years. Actually, there's a really funny and quite striking photo in this book as well, and I don't know if it's one of yours. It's quite early. It's Nick and Mick, and Nick just has this shark's teeth grin, which is quite alarming and quite, because you just don't see it very often, and there's this like rictus almost smile.
No, that's not what I'm on. But there's two of them. It's Nick and Mick.
Yeah.
Those ones. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, they're very unusual, and he chose them.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. Karen, I'd like to talk about the collection that you edited with Tanyard LDL, which was academic but also quite accessible essays about all these different thematic aspects of the band. Can you tell us how that came about and what it was that made you confident that there was a book's worth of essays to be written about the Bad Seeds?
Okay, I'll try to do that. Where to start the story, I suppose, is the question. I suppose, like Gerard, I actually probably started really getting into the Bad Seeds around those albums about 1995, 1996. I'd seen them prior to that, but it was at that point that I actually started really, going from being a David Bowie fan to being a Nick Cave fan in a major way.
You're allowed to be both.
You are, but I transitioned
Not unrelated figures, really.
my
I'd say Bowie's a
allegiances.
very big influence on Nick.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm saying there is I had this interest in Nick Cave, which was becoming a little bit obsessive. But I also had what I was interested in through my, my PhD kind of topics and my intellectual sort of life. And they were running sort of parallel. And then, strangely, it was the horse story of Nick Cave's desire to have a statue erected of himself in Warracknabeal that actually brought my worlds together, because I was looking at horse breaking as a kind of metaphor for conquest in Australia, really, of the colonial sort of experience and the attempt to kind of belong in the Australian landscape. So this actually really interested me. It wasn't just a little incidental joke. It was actually, wow, wouldn't that really be cool? Nick Cave on a rearing horse as the man from Snowy River. So I started playing with these ideas. And I think I initially wrote a paper which Mark had a look at, because you were editing Meanjin, and an edition
That's
of
right.
a rock and roll edition of Meanjin, and I sent it to you, and you said, that's lovely, we'll publish it, and then you didn't.
Sorry about that. I had a few problems with that issue.
Yeah.
I think I squeezed in a fair amount, but...
Well, anyway, so I then offered it to a conference, an Australian literature conference, and surprisingly, it actually got a really good reception. Like, I had given papers before, and my husband's in the room, he can vouch for this. 2 people have come to listen to some of the papers I've given on fascinating topics, such as Wordsworth's relationship to Hartley Coleridge. I had an audience of 2. And then when I offered a paper offered a paper on Nick Cave and how he wasn't a Prince of Darkness. I had a whole room of people, and then the next day I had Geraldine Doog wanting to interview me on Radio National. And out of that conference came the person who chaired my conference paper was Tanyard LDL, and Lynn was there. And people said, you should write a book on Nick Cave. And I said, I'd love to write a book on Nick Cave, but I don't know enough. I know what I know, but I don't know enough about the religious stuff. I don't know enough about his work with the cinema. I don't know the early days. I don't know. There's so much I don't know that I couldn't do this book on Nick Cave. And then Tanya sort of said, oh, well, I'll do a paper. And I think Lynn said, oh, I'll do a paper. And then we sort of had 3, and we put out a call for other people who might be interested on this sort of international kind of hub, this academic hub. I forget what it's called now. But I suppose our concept was that we wanted people from all different walks in all different countries offering their own perspective, so that everyone could be an expert on their little thing, and no one person really could have written this book. And we had an extraordinary, I mean, to me it felt extraordinary. We had offers, I don't want to exaggerate, but I think it was well more than 50 people from all over the world. And I'm talking, you know, different Italians, Germans, people from America, Canada, quite a few Australian people, and all sorts of different perspectives. And we kind of then thought, okay, well, what would be a really interesting mix of people? So we sort of initially commissioned, I think, 12 of the essays. And I can't remember what happened first now, because this is actually a long time ago. But we then tried to find a publisher before we said, go ahead and write your paper. We had the abstracts of what we wanted to do, but then we had to get a publisher involved. And that was actually very frustrating, because while we believed in this and we wanted it to be something that we thought Nick Cave fans would like and academics would like, publishers weren't entirely convinced that it would hit both markets. But it ended up getting picked up by Ashgate, and they had a series, I think it's popular and folk music. They had a whole series that they published in this, and they thought our book would fit very well. And that's how that came to be.
Hey, I've got to add to that I actually think this project of Nick's partly descends from your book, Cultural Seeds. And I remember when Cultural Seeds came out talking to Nick, and he was really pleased about it. It's not to say that he liked every single thing in it, but he was really glad that his work was being taken seriously, and that there are all these new ideas and different approaches coming at his work in a sort of deeper or more interesting way. And I mean, Nick's like this hungry cat. He just seems to absorb everything around him. So, you know, in relationship to the mercyseat that I wrote about, it's partly to do with him reading In the Belly of the Beast. It's partly to do with him being in Ghost of the Civil Dead. It's partly to do with him reading the novels of Jim Thompson. It's partly to do with his addiction. It's partly to do with the relationship that he was in. It's partly to do with his interest in the Old Testament, you know. So it's autobiography on multiple levels, from obsession, art, to selfhood. And, you know, so that's why you have this sort of constellation of readings. And to sort of bring it back to Cultural Seeds and what you're talking about, you know, Nick often will sort of absorb things from you, or things from around the world, and it could crop up very quickly, or it might be 10, 20 years later. And I do think Cultural Seeds was a kind of birthing thing for this in many respects.
Yeah, well, it's great to hear that. But I guess I was just tracking who was covering his songs. You know, where were they coming from? What are all the references that are coming up on my Google alert that I have permanently set on Nick Cave? Like, where is he being quoted? Where is he being referenced? In what context? And I was just aware that there was so much there that was really, really interesting. And that his ideas were seeding other people's ideas as well. So that play on words there was meant to be, you know, in all different directions. And I was very touched, because I heard that he wanted a copy for his mum. And that's one of my biggest achievements in life. Yeah.
Just consequently to that, he is a curator of his own career in a very big way. He's in that control, that curation. But it's not, it doesn't seem to me to be a sort of a superficial or transitory sort of curation. He's actually really, he reads the essays, he thinks about them, and he feeds it back to you as a writer. You said this in this essay, and you said that, and he knew the essay better than I did by the time he was telling it back to me. He's deeply intellectually interested in lots of those ideas that came from those essays, yeah.
And we see many of them have been reprinted or edited and included in this new book, which he had a big hand in as well. We talked earlier and have touched on a bit now the relationship between Nick and Mick Harvey, which characterised so much of his career. But I would like to bring it a bit forward into closer to the present day and talk about Nick and Warren Ellis and their relationship and how that has really become such a hallmark of the past few albums, and also their work, composing in scores and so on. But I'd like to start with Mark, but I'm actually interested in anyone who would like to offer their thoughts on what that relationship is and how it maybe differs from other creative partnerships that Nick has had throughout his creative career.
Well, I guess the obvious thing to say is that Nick and Warren write together, and that was really never the case before. Nick would usually bring fully formed songs or lyrics, with melodic ideas or frames or sketches or whatever, whereas he and Warren jam together and sort of build songs. And the way I understand, at least, quite often the lyrics will arise out of that, and then Nick will go away and sort of build off that again. So it's a much more sort of profoundly organic relationship. I also think Warren's changed a lot from his entry into the Bad Seeds when he was just playing violin to now when he's like sort of the sonic supermaster of sounds. And there's something about that experimentation in Warren's sonic palette that seems to have taken Nick deeper into, I don't know, I can't think of the right word, like a subconsciousness or another level of consciousness, and it's sort of inherent, not just in Nick's more sort of abstract kind of and poetic lyrics, but the sonic palette itself is creating this sense of being more involved in an inner consciousness. So it's developed a lot, and I think it's a markedly different relationship to the sort of more narratively directed sort of earlier work that he was doing with Mick Harvey and other incarnations of the Bad Seeds, although there was plenty of madness and wildness there as well. It's not like you can build a wall between them. And I mean, I don't know, Warren's a pretty elusive guy, really. I don't think he'd talk to me at all if he didn't have to, because Nick had asked me to do the biography. He's, quite a private person by nature, but I just think he and Nick get on really well. They like each other. They have a very relaxed energy, whereas I guess you're sort of projecting back over things, but he and Nick and Mick Harvey had a sort of more formal relationship and a kind of creative relationship that came about from high school and to some extent kind of just happened, and Mick adapted himself to the needs as they went along, whether he was the band leader or an arranger or simply just playing drums, like his contribution would sort of expand and contract. So, I mean, they're obviously two very different phases, the Mick Harvey era and the Warren Ellis era, and there's a lot of greatness in both, and it's been amazing really to see Warren expand, and I guess probably in remarks about Nick as a sort of a journeying artist, why we're all here, of course, is Nick never stands still. There's a sense of him constantly growing and evolving and not being frightened to adapt and move, and Warren's sort of exponential growth as a musician is a kind of an accompaniment to that. So Warren's an explorer as well, and I think Nick just naturally gravitates to people that are like that.
Yeah, beautifully put. I don't think anyone else wants to add anything, because that was such a beautiful encapsulation of that dynamic. Unless, no. But something you just mentioned, which I think is really interesting, is that the Prince of Darkness label and these kind of some of the misconceptions and perhaps misinformed ideas about Nick Cave that swirl around. And I thought it would be kind of interesting to discuss those with a panel of people who've thought about Nick Cave a lot and are very sympathetic to his creative pursuits. I think particularly when you look at the early records, a lot of people would say they are what Nick calls angry young man records. There's a lot of noise, a lot of fury, and I think there is a perception among perhaps people who haven't listened to them very much that it's not much skill and just a lot of noise. So I think it's really interesting to think about why, and that's true. There is a lot of noise and there is a lot of anger, but I want to talk about why it is and how it is that those records and that the band transcend those kind of easy and lazy categorizations and what elevates the music beyond that. So does anyone want to sort of speak to that?
While everyone's thinking, I'm going to just say this because it occurs to me that there's the journeying metaphor that we've been talking about and the restlessness and the kind of moving through. But at the same time, there's absolutely a repetition, isn't there, of some of those central concerns. And one of them to me would be the idea or the trope, if you like, the figure of the loved one and how the loved one has gone, the absence of the loved one. And that overlays with the absence of God, I think, in a lot of his lyrics. And he comes back again and again and again to that sense of a lost love and the melancholy, the nostalgia that generates. So they're kind of different moments, aren't they?
Wow.
And I don't know how we sort of bring them together, but he does.
No, that's a really interesting perception.
Oh, thank you.
What is God, of course, the Father, the Son, or the Holy Spirit? You know.
Blowing where it will. So I don't know. There's the Nick Cave that is repetitive, almost obsessive, yes, with that sort of the lost loved one. And even back in the early angry stuff, like From Her to Eternity, he's got to go upstairs and kill her because she's too beautiful and she's too there and he can't have her, so he's going to go and kill her. The logic of that's interesting, isn't it? But nevertheless, it's still that trope of the loved one, the beauty that is too much, that has to go.
I think that's a really interesting correlation to draw, particularly with the song, which isn't on this anthology, but the song Skeleton Tree itself. And I must have listened to that song about 50 times, I think, when that record came out, before I realised that, and I don't really actually know when that particular song was written and if it is responding to the tragic death of his son. But there's that line in it at the beginning, "In the window a candle, maybe you will see," and I was like, holy shit, this song is actually like literally a vigil for a lost, it's a song about bereavement, like very explicitly. And I'd just kind of been coasting along with the general kind of atmosphere of melancholy of that song, I think, for quite a while before that really kind of hit me. And when it did, it knocked the wind out of me. And now I can barely listen to that song now. And it's a song that I really love. But that's speaking as well, I suppose, to the kind of, the different senses or the different manifestations of loss in his songs, because Oh Children, of course, is another song which is all about loss. It's redolent with imagery of the gulags and the death camps and whatnot, and that's another really heartbreaking song, but that's sort of more, coming at it again from a different angle as an almost literary exercise, I think. It can be...
Vigil's a great word there, isn't it, for some of those songs?
Yeah, beautiful. Well, let's talk about the past sort of year in the development of the band, and obviously Skeleton Tree came out, One More Time with Feeling came out, and both were sort of in some ways overshadowed by this being the first thing that Nick had released since the death of his son, and people looking for correlation and looking for meaning, despite many of the songs having been written well before that happened. And Mark, you had an interview with Nick recently in The Guardian where he spoke about how helpful it has been for him to grieve openly, and that there seems to have been an opening up to his fans. He speaks about how meaningful it was that his fans, got in touch and sent their wishes after after their loss. And I think that seems against type for what you would have expected. He had always been such a private man and so in control of what he let out. And there seems to have been a new openness. And even the shows recently that he did on his tour in January, which I'm sure many of us attended, and probably many of the audience have attended as well, they felt there were moments of real openness and reciprocity between Nick and the audience. And I'm interested in everyone's thoughts about what has changed. I mean, apart from the obvious, but like what that sort of feels like as a fan, as a listener, what that openness means. Mark, do you want to start off?
Okay.
Well,
okay, thanks, Bled.
it's an acknowledgement of the audience. I mean, they were totally different concerts. Absolute, completely most unusual concerts I've ever seen from him. They're a totally different feeling. He was drinking up the love of his audience. He needed it, he wanted it, he got it, and he thanked us for it, I think. I think that's what happened.
Yeah, I was there and been to, come every single time he comes, I go. But I did think that this last one in Melbourne was very different to any other that I personally had witnessed, just in terms of how far he was leaning out into the crowd and being held and actually trusting and almost throwing himself at the crowd. I mean, I wasn't right at the front, but I could see what was happening right at the front. And I've never seen that kind of trust before, and it was almost... And just the way the band were actually just waiting for a signal all the time to actually know where it was all going to go. It just felt incredibly free and unplanned, and that kind of trust. It seemed quite different to me. I'm agreeing with what you're saying. Not quite sure what that means, but yeah, I noticed it.
I don't think we have to determine a meaning in it, because I think it's still fresh, right? And it's kind of, it can be an instinctive behaviour and an instinctive change that hasn't necessarily been assimilated into a creative intent at this point.
I think Bleddyn put it extremely well. It's precisely that kind of energy, and I guess to add to that and what you're saying as well, that just what kind of blew me out, I don't know how many times I've seen Nick Cave over the years, and before that the birthday party, but I was just sort of like, oh my God, he's gotten better. It was just that there was like a quantum step had occurred, and I think that the artistic evolution was already underway with Push the Sky Away, and you shouldn't sort of submerge the artistic evolution into the tragedy, but of course the tragedy has been a fire on top of it. Losing Arthur and everything around it, but the new kind of creative realm had already been opened up earlier, and obviously that relates to the creative relationship with Warren Ellis as well. But yeah, it was like, God, Nick is getting better
And freer.
Yeah, and
Freer.
You're right.
So we're going to start doing audience questions in a few minutes, but I will just finish us off with a slightly fun one for the end of this discussion. One of my favourite things about this book is that in each of the contributors' biographies, very serious, so-and-so studied at this place and has these titles, and then there'll be a few lines about a meaningful Bad Seeds song that they enjoy listening to in the shower or whatever it might be. So I thought on that note of the songs that kind of touch you in a different way, or that that you really connect with, if each of you would just like to share your favourite or a favourite song and why it's special to you, and it doesn't have to be the same one that you've mentioned in the book, but it can be.
It won't be. One that I've always liked, which Nick disparages because he nicked a line from Nabokov, is "Loom of the Land." And I've always felt that's such a unbelievably tender song, and maybe that's all it is, but I've always loved that one.
Yeah, beautiful.
The one I mentioned in the book is Brompton Oratory, which it's a very short and very brief, and powerful little song, isn't it? That syncopated rhythm all the way through it, and the kind of organ music in the background going up into the vault of the church. But the story is completely otherwise. The story is about loss and the smell of her on his fingers as he takes the cup up to his lips. Just amazing conjunction of the physical and the spiritual. Yeah.
I said Stranger Than Kindness in the book, but currently I think Magneto is my favourite, one of my favourites.
How good was that live on that last tour? It was totally transformed, the way they performed that as a band.
And it was just obviously got so many things filtering through it that you can sort of feel and speculate on, but you're in this sort of intimate yet vast sort of cosmic space that's sort of star broken and cosmic and damaged and beautiful and trying to maintain some sense of humanity, and it's fucking incredible.
Okay. Well, I actually was a bit controversial in the book, and I said Wonderful Life, which didn't make it. But I'm actually going to single out another which I love, which isn't there either, which is Little Empty Boat. And I love the line, I am the resurrection, babe, and you're standing on my foot. I just think, I mean, that's a classic example of being really, really funny, but also being pretty serious too anyway.
I'm going to go with the one that I said in the book, which I guess is kind of in keeping with Mark's liking the sort of current Bad Seeds trajectory of damaged humanity surrounded by vast cosmic spaces, and Higgs Boson Blues.
Yes, we approve of that choice.
Can I just add to that? One of the weird things I find about listening to Nick's music for Push the Sky Away and Skeleton Tree is that I find you actually actively kind of daydream in it, in the sense of dreaming while you're walking along, and it's almost as if you're stimulated into this poetic headspace where your mind is streaming not only with the specific things he is saying, but with your own kind of memories and abstractions. You become a kind of vessel of poetry and poetic thought because there's something about the music. Does that make sense?
I think there's a lot more space on those, as far as the production and the arrangements of those two most recent albums go. There's this huge kind of space, which obviously could do with the elimination of a real lead guitarist in the Bad Seeds, but they've just become more vaporous and ethereal in nature, I think.
So there's room for you to think and dream while you're listening to the music. It just takes you away.
You're not being pummeled into submission anymore.
By the finger, he calls it, the finger. Too much of the finger? Well, maybe, Nick, I don't know. Maybe.
All right, we're going to turn over for audience questions now. So Fiona's got a roving mic. If you'd like to ask a question, please just raise your hand and she will come to you. And we have one with this lady in the purple.
Thank you for... Is that on? Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity. Just a couple of things about... I'm not sure if it was in the Guardian interview or not, but a quote from Nick where he said that he'd already had the tragedy. He thought he'd had the tragedy with his father's death, but it turns out that was actually a lead up to waiting for the real one. And in tying that in with his openness in his recent music and film, I'm interested in the panel's views on the 20,000 Days, because I thought that was perhaps the first real opening of the door for us to him. And I wonder whether the further Skeleton Tree, etc., would have been perhaps as open if he hadn't used that as a prelude. Your thoughts, please?
Anyone?
Well, see, I actually thought 20,000 Days was a very Nick in the sense that it was highly controlled by him, and that it was very much a constructed essay and very revealing about his creative processes, and to some extent, of course, revealing about him, but for me, nothing like the sort of the rawness that's present in One More Time with Feeling. Like, Nick was absolutely in control of 20,000. One More Time with Feeling, he was obviously a more damaged and vulnerable person. So in relation to the the loss of his father, which was obviously a key incident when he was young. Yeah, I mean, you think you've experienced a tragedy and then something comes along and you lose your son, which is a much greater thing. I don't think any parent here would want to sort of die before their child. I've got 3 kids. It's certainly not, it's the last thing that you would wish or want. So I don't know, I mean, whether you can get too sort of fatalistic about these things, though, whether what's meant to be and what occurs, I don't know, I'm probably not being very articulate, but yeah, that's all I'll say about the movies, at least.
Does anyone else want to speak to that? No? Do we have any other questions? Down in the front row here.
Yeah, it was interesting hearing about the differences with working with Warren and Mick, and I was just always been a bit curious as to what it was like when he was working with Blixer.
I reckon ask Bleddyn that one. Yeah, what do you reckon?
Oh, I don't know that I'm responsible for this, but I don't know. Blixer kind of wore out his welcome, I think, after a while. He used up his bag of tricks. To my observation, what happened is that he would do stuff and they just wouldn't use it. There's Nocturama, the notorious flop, in Nick's words, in sick bag. Blixer bought a pedal steel guitar in Melbourne and brought it into the studio and proceeded to teach himself how to play it. And my understanding is that Nick's first comment was, the one sound that I can't stand, the pedal steel guitar. Blixer is a kind of like a thorn in the foot. And that was a very useful and function for making things loose and unstructured, and for reducing people's pretension, but he used up his bag of tricks, I think. Warren's bag of tricks is a bigger bag, and Warren is a much more engaging personality. I'm going to get shit for this, but Warren is a much more lovable character, as I think everybody here will probably know. He's not very verbal, but he's verbose. If you've ever seen him with the Dirty Three, and he's utterly charming as an individual. And he's very, very interested in learning and experimenting and in doing new things. He's not interested in doing the same thing over and over again. So he's a very useful foil. I mean, those same things are true of Blixer, but he's just not, to me, he's just not as dynamic.
I tell you, you're just making me think, though, like, I saw No Barton play about 2 years, 3 years, and they're one of the best bands I've ever seen in my life. They were just, like, I was overwhelmed by how great they are, and it just makes me think, listening to the question, Blixer, Mick Harvey and his work with everybody from the Cruel Sea to PJ Harvey to Nick, of course, Warren Ellis with the Dirty Three, people like Barry Adamson and all these other travellers. Like, so many of the Bad Seeds run their own music careers and are total dynamos in their own right. And if they'd never been in the Bad Seeds, would be legends themselves anyway. And it kind of knocks me out that Nick is kind of confident enough to bring them into that sort of entourage and get the best out of them. It's kind of like a super team, really. Incredible.
Yeah, great. I think we had another question down the front here somewhere. Yeah.
Just in talking about the different people Nick's worked with, I've always been fascinated in the coupling of Nick and Kylie Minogue. I'd just be interested to know your thoughts on that, particularly from Nick's side, how that evolved.
Bleddyn, do you want to handle that one too?
Am I fielding all these ones? Well, it's a marriage of opposites, isn't it? And it was very smart. He had a 10-year solo career at that stage, and you don't get the sense that he listens to business advice, and you don't talk to him about business. You talk to him about shit and jokes and stuff. But obviously he is concerned about his own career, and he was strangely fascinated with the very young Kylie, and strangely attracted to her as well.
You know, you've got to state the obvious. She's quite attractive, and he's a male, and you know, as well as all the aesthetic opposites and paradoxes and contradictions. You know, I hate to be, obvious, but I'm sure there was at least 25% of the obvious in her.
She also could sing, and
sure,
it was opposites that were working there.
Totally, I mean, it's a brilliant sort of marriage on so many levels. It's just great.
Did you shoot that series of the Kylie and Nick? No. I think that's Tony. There's an amazing series of Kylie and the little doll. Yes, the doll, the baby. This sort of holy family. It's incredible. Kylie's out of it in those shots.
Any other questions?
Question for you, Mark Mordue. We've been waiting for quite a while for this, with bated breath, for the biography. And I'm just wondering how that's going, and or is it a sort of never-ending journey that?
No, it's not a never-ending journey. I mean, like people kind of have this idea of a biography as a sort of, particularly with someone who's alive, like, oh my God, it's impossible because he's still alive, so things keep occurring. But of course, I could end with him jumping off a bridge in Wangaratta. Yeah. So the problem, except that's in the Sick Bag song now, but it's more a matter of having enough density to sort of embrace the whole thing. I mean, my real problem was, which you know, basically, was financial and emotional, all the classic things: relationship breakup, lack of money, crashed my car, couple of years, excuse the phrasing, just fucked up. And really all through that phrase, I have to say, Nick was really great. I kind of went through a long, long passage where it felt like the only person who thought I could still do it was Nick, and also, which is an indication of, he's really quite a generous, warm guy. I think he understands that things go wrong in people's lives. I really appreciated that a lot, and I'm kind of really only back in, I just kind of like my comeback here, like I have returned, I am the resurrection, and you're standing on my foot. So there. So I'm still on it, and I still want to do a really great book, and sorry, it's just taken me a long time.
Maybe you should do a 3-volume.
Well, actually, I wanted to fucking release I actually wrote a book, and really what I wrote was a book about Nick's boyhood up until the period with the birthday party, but the publishers felt that there wouldn't be the interest there. Retrospectively, I think that
100
was
copies.
A mistake,
We'll
because what I needed, because the project is so vast, I needed to get free of that material and also get the money that would involve to then move on to the next stage. Everybody wants to hear all the stuff about the aesthetic struggle and the vastness of Nick's career, and it's like, no, I just fucking got a huge credit card debt and I can't pay the rent, and like my love life's all fucked there. People don't want to know about that stuff, but that's the problem.
Any other questions?
Thank you. It's quite a broad question, but I'm curious as to your thoughts. So there's Nick Cave, the author. It's a very solo pursuit, but most of the music comes out as Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, Nick Cave and this other entity he's coupled with. So a couple of years ago, there was a fantastic theatre tour he did, which was advertised, at least in New Zealand, as Nick Cave solo, in which case Nick Cave got on stage and played Bad Seed songs with Warren Ellis and other members of the Bad Seeds. So what is the difference, or maybe a better way of saying it, what is the purpose of this other entity? Why has he not just been Nick Cave, the musician and artist? Why does he need to have this other entity called the Bad Seeds?
I don't know. I went to that show, so maybe I can start people off, because we noticed a lot of people left. A lot of people didn't like Nick Cave's solo, and they didn't like the quieter songs, and they got up and left. And don't know why, but they seemed maybe a way of performing some of the quieter things without needing to go, I don't know, to 12 on the scale in the way that people expect a Bad Seeds show to somehow. I think people perhaps have an expectation when it's Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds that it will become really, really loud at some point and get very, I guess, transformative and transcendent. And perhaps the solo stuff was maybe a way of doing something a little bit different, but not everyone liked it. I don't know. What
It's an experiment, that tour and that period, and where we are now. I think you can probably pinpoint it. You know, people look at like things not working out like it's some fucking disaster, and but usually it's that moment when someone does become great, because they've taken the risk to fail and to mess things up in order to find a point of evolution.
Other questions? There's this fellow in the checked shirt.
We see the influence of the city that Nick lives in, particularly in his early career. You think about Sao Paulo years and Berlin years. With the news that probably most of us read earlier this month that he's moving to Los Angeles, am I the only one concerned about potentially the impact that has on his music style? And I'd be interested to get
what you think. White sand shoes, yacht rock, bit of a crisscross kind of feeling coming through.
I think of Miley Cyrus in a swimming pool in Toluca Lake, to be honest, and you know the references that he's made to what
Steely Dan,
the cultural wasteland of Los Angeles. I'm just interested, in your opinion on that influence.
The panel discussed that before the meeting tonight. We were talking about what we felt. But are you sure it's Los Angeles? We thought we could handle America, maybe New York, but not Los Angeles. But sorry to those from Los Angeles. But there's a terrific essay in this collection about the relationship between place and I forget who it's by. Does anyone remember? Place and his writing. And Nick actually disagrees with that. He says, I'm in place, but I'm always displaced. I'm a stranger. It's not exactly those places that are directly influential on me. And he actually says a very interesting, it's the relationships, it's the love at the time that's been the most influential on him in those places. So that's a kind of interesting mix of questions. So maybe he could outlive Los Angeles and be something else.
Well, maybe anyone else want to comment on the big LA Hollywoodification? No, let's just cross our fingers and hope it's not.
Maybe it's just the least likely place anyone would expect him to be, so that's why he's going there.
Yeah. Other questions?
No.
Maybe not. Well,
we could ask them what their favourite song is, or their.
No, let's not open that can of worms. Questions only. This guy in the front here.
I wanted to ask a question to Gerard about more to do with Roland S. Howard and touching on the newer albums of Nick Cave with Skeleton Tree and Push the Sky Away. I thought with the vastness and the bigger sound of them songs, I thought there was a real similarity with the end of These Immortal Souls with Crowned and some of the later Roland S. Howard. It's like a bigger kind of the vastness around the songs.
So from Push the Skyway and Skeleton Tree, were you saying?
Yeah, I thought it was the style is, I think, more like that.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd agree actually, but I would say if I personally can think of any kind of correlation in Roland Howard's discography for some of the the sound and the direction that the Bad Seeds have gone, and it would be more in songs like Autoluminescent itself, and that huge sense of space.
That's actually more what I was talking about.
Like Crowned is such a huge big rocking kind of number.
Yeah.
I love that song. But yeah, like Autoluminescent and some of the tracks off that in particular, I think, definitely potentially. I have no idea. Like I wouldn't suppose that that's been any kind of influence on Nick at this point necessarily. But it's definitely an interesting sort of aesthetic parallel to consider.
This kind of return to non-narrative songwriting, which has been remarked upon, I guess is a bit of a Roland S. Howard kind of thing that he was doing right from the start, really.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, he certainly has never really been a narrative songwriter. And I guess a song like The Golden Age of Bloodshed lyrically bears a pretty strong resemblance to a lot of some of Nick's best songs, like kind of the walking songs, the driving songs, those sorts of songs where, again, it's just this figure moving through a world of complete entropy and chaos.
I mean, we've just briefly, we've talked about a bunch of different collaborators and their relationships with Nick, but I mean, would you maybe like to talk about what you see as having characterised the dynamic between Nick and Roland, and not now and not kind of looking at what's come after, but at the time?
Yeah, well, I'm sure Bleddyn can probably speak much more to this than I can, having been there. I've been talking to people about it certainly, but it seems, I guess, to an extent have been. I mean, yeah, obviously they were very, very tight for a long time, and then something happened, and they no longer really were. For various reasons. It seems I've got many conflicting accounts of why that is, but as well, I think they were sort of good foils for each other because they weren't very similar. Aesthetically, or that the one thing I keep getting told is that Roland was actually writing real kind of hooky songs. Apparently there was this whole series of songs which he wrote for the birthday party which never really got laid down. A couple of people have told me, which were much more kind of almost pop orientated, whereas at that point, Nick was more interested in wheeling off into the kind of territory of something like Swampland, or and you can really see the way that that song's influence reverberates through From Her to Eternity, certainly. So I just think they were kind of really interesting, almost a quasi-adversarial relationship, at least creatively speaking, certainly. But yeah, I don't know, Bleddyn, again, you were there, you saw it all. We will have much more to say about this than I do at this point. Get back to me in about 15 friggin' years.
Bleddyn, do you want to?
Well, the birthday party was a collection of 4 extremely smart and strong-willed individuals and Phil Calvert. And they were intimidatingly intelligent. They were unique at a very young age. They were individuals. They were their own people. And they, at that stage, when they were called the birthday party, they enjoyed that friction. They loved it and they thrived off it. But after a time, it seemed to me that Nick didn't want to sing Roland's songs. And if Roland was going to sing them, he had nothing to do on stage because he'd given up the idea of the occasional playing of sax, and so he would have nothing to do. So it was an ego contest, basically.
It's also really dangerous to look at the birthday party excessively through the prism of Nick Cave, because the birthday party were a band, an extremely powerful band, and obviously they put Nick in a position that from where he could then evolve into the star he is today. But when you saw the birthday party, you certainly did not notice Tracy Pugh playing bass or Mick Harvey playing the most terrifying drums you'd ever heard in your life, or Roland Howard with his cigarette, down to the end burning, still hanging miraculous, just sort of, looking like some sort of Doc Holliday from heroin Melbourne, and Nick with hair up to the fucking sky. They were quite an impressive visual entity, all of them. And yeah, I always think often it gets looked at through the Nick Cave thing, but they were a real band.
Do we have any other audience questions? We've just got a few minutes left before we wrap up. Anyone? The guy over here on the floor.
Thanks. This isn't really a question. I'd just be interested in your impressions. You've all touched upon it about Nick and the Bad Seeds' ability to reinvent themselves. But from what I do for a living, which is sell records, I've noticed very few artists who so deep into a career can suddenly start selling records to 15 and 16 and 17 and 18-year-olds when that artist is old enough to be their father, their grandfather possibly. And the solo tour that you were talking about, the so-called solo tour, I went to 2 of those gigs and saw long-term fans go, this is bullshit. And people of the age of 16, 17 and 18 go, this is the best thing I've ever seen in my life. And I just wonder how you react to an artist who's able to do that.
I'm not sure why that is, but it's certainly something which has happened and which I've definitely observed. I think the first time I saw the Bad Seeds would have been Homebake in Sydney in 2003, and I haven't missed a tour since then. And I've definitely noticed that the kind of the median age of the audience has been kind of lowering, or at least inhabiting 2 poles, or not even that. It's just everyone is there now, really. But I interviewed Nick a couple of years ago. He gave me this wonderful interview. We chatted on Skype for a while, but then a lot of it, I felt like I was keeping him entertained while he was on tour, and we were just doing a question a day via email. And it was after maybe a show he did in Copenhagen or something. I got this email from him, which wasn't, part of the interview, but he just was telling me that he had this amazing show that night where at the end of the set, they'd perform Push the Sky Away as the final song, as they've been doing for a few years now. And he said all of these, young women from sort of late teens, early 20s, stormed the stage and just sat around the band's feet. And he's like, they boiled up around us like lava. It was very pin droppy. And I don't know, that to me, I'm like, I wish I saw that.
I like to think that these young people are all the students that I've taught. But possibly there's that effect too, that a lot of teachers love Nick Cave and are probably using Nick Cave in their classrooms, and then maybe the adults are teaching their children. Our poor son was actually in his cradle when Murder Ballads was released, and that's what he had to go to sleep by, and it actually worked really well because it is a lullaby if you don't listen to it. So, maybe that's just how the young people have come to Nick Cave.
Can I be a little bit sort of against that, or just a question mark? I've mentioned Nick Cave and different songs. I've taught the Mercyseat in a particular context, and students at my university said, "Who?" and have never heard of him. Now that's not an empirical bit of data. They have now. That's true. But I'm wondering just how niched and what the size of the audience is. I'd be really interested to whether there's much research around about that, because he's pretty niched, right?
Maya Music Bowl.
ICC in Sydney sold out twice. That was like the new entertainment centre there. He's definitely.
So do you think he's huge? He's a mega star, or where would you put him in the?
They're playing unknown. How many concerts are they playing at the O2, which is a vast emporium?
His career has for sure expanded. I think in relation to what you said, I think Grinderman had a lot to do with it. I think Grinderman also helped crack open America a bit more. And
Grinderman are huge in LA.
Yeah, they probably are. They appeal to the LA thing. And again, I think a lot of sort of more diehard Bad Seeds fan were like, not such fans of the Grinderman stuff necessarily. But now I think, what Blenn's saying is true. Like Nick's become massive, and it's a cumulative thing. He's kept doing. The worst Nick ever does is good. Really, it's like a disappointment. It's only good, Like that's when it's a bummer. But mostly it's great, and then at times it's startling, and live is really where it's always happening. So the level of consistency, that body of work across a 30-plus career, and, not to be crass about it, but Leonard Cohen's gone, Lou Reed's gone, Bowie. Nick has really risen to the place that I think he's always aspired to be, and you know, he's up there sort of with the gods, really. It's quite amazing. And, yeah, there's not many people around like him that have that such a consistent body of work. I think consistency is a real key in Nick's career, even if you're not you don't have to be a fan of everything, but I don't think he ever puts out anything that he's not trying to make great.
Beautiful. Well, that might be a really nice place to leave it with singing the praises of the man that we're here talking about. I'd like to say a very big thank you to all of our panellists. I'd like to thank all of you for being here tonight as well, and to the Art Centre for putting on this event and for their constant devotion to keeping records of Nick Cave so that we can all come back and pour through his diaries in the years to come. And finally, this was provided to me by the Art Centre, but I would have said it anyway, to Mr. Cave and the Bad Seeds for their invaluable contribution to the music world. We'd like to thank them. So thanks very much. Enjoy your night.